The night shift started like it always did, Margaret Walsh pushing through the employee entrance at 10:22 p.m., badge already clipped to her scrub pocket, moving with the kind of invisible precision that made people forget she was there the moment she passed. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar monotone as she walked the fourth-floor ICU corridor at St. Michael's in Savannah, her steps measured, her breathing controlled, her hand steady despite the slight tremor that had developed in her left wrist over the past 3 years. Nobody noticed the tremor meant something different from what they thought. Nobody noticed anything at all. She hung her jacket in locker 247, the old field jacket with the worn cuffs and the small, almost invisible rip along the seam where someone had carefully sewn something back in, something that shouldn't exist in a hospital locker or anywhere else that could be documented. The patch inside was faded now, nearly colorless, the embroidered insignia of the 3rd Special Forces Group barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look and what you were searching for. Margaret's fingers found it without thinking, a ritual performed 1,095 times, once per shift for 3 years. Touch it. Remember it. Put it away. Come back tomorrow. She closed the locker with a soft click and turned toward the ward. The ICU smelled like antiseptic and coffee and the particular staleness of recycled air that had passed through 1,000 sets of lungs before hers. Margaret moved through the corridors with parade ground precision, the kind of movement that came from muscle memory so deep it had outlasted the career that created it, outlasted the woman she had been before she became the woman she needed to be. She checked the assignment board. Room for 47 was hers, among others. Room for 47 was always hers. She had specifically requested it, and the night supervisor had stopped asking why 3 years ago. Dr. Edward Mercer stood at the nurse's station reviewing supply orders when Margaret arrived to clock in. She was aware of him the way a person becomes aware of a predator in the room, not through conscious observation but through something older, something that never fully left you once it had been trained into your nervous system. He was tall, perhaps 45, the kind of expensive-looking man who wore his watch like a weapon. A Rolex, probably. Margaret had learned to read wealth the way other people read facial expressions. The watch cost more than she made in 3 months. His posture said he knew this and wanted everyone else to know it too. She did not acknowledge him. She did not make eye contact. She nodded to Sandra at the desk, "Evening, Sandra," and picked up her tablet to review the night's assignments. This was what she did. This was who she was here. Just a nurse. Just a woman in her late 50s who had taken the night shift to avoid the day, who kept her head down and her history buried so deep that even her own son didn't entirely understand what had been buried or why. Mercer watched her. She could feel it like heat from an approaching fire, but she did not turn around. She did not acknowledge the watching. Instead, she moved through the unit with the same invisible efficiency that had carried her through the past 3 years, for checks, medication reconciliation, ventilator settings logged and verified. The work was methodical, careful, the kind of care that suggested someone who understood that precision mattered when human life was the variable being controlled. Room for 47 was at the far end of the corridor, where the hallway turned and the light seemed to thin slightly, as if the fluorescents couldn't quite reach this far. Colonel James Reeves lay in the hospital bed as he always did, motionless, his breathing mechanical, his body reduced to what he had been in fragments. 8 months since the IED in Tikrit. 8 months since the operation that had made her disappear from every database the Pentagon controlled. The official record said the operation never happened. The official record said Captain Margaret Walsh had retired honorably and vanished into civilian life. The official record, as it turned out, was a complicated thing. She began her work without speaking, measuring output, checking the central line, adjusting the foredrip with movements that were practiced and nearly invisible. Her hands moved with the precision of someone who had done this exact procedure hundreds of times, in conditions far more hostile than a climate-controlled hospital room. The tremor in her left wrist disappeared when she was working. It always did. 8 months today, she whispered, and the words came out exactly as quiet as she needed them to be. Your son, my son, I should say, he's reading about Carthage in history class now. Says he wants to understand why empires fall. I told him most of them just stop paying attention to what matters. She adjusted the monitor lead, checked the rhythm. Sinus, steady, unremarkable. He doesn't know about you. He'll never know. But I think you should know that he's okay. He's more than okay. He's the kind of kid who asks questions about old wars, and that means he's thinking about consequences. That's what matters. The monitor beeped its rhythmic, indifferent pulse. Beep. 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 The sound had become the soundtrack to her night shifts, the mechanical proof that the body persisted even when the mind no longer navigated it. Margaret finished her charting and moved to the next room, then the next, her evening following its established pattern of competence and invisibility. By 1:23 a.m., Dr. Mercer was still at the nurse's station, but now with a printed stack of supply orders spread across the desk in front of him like a prosecutor arranging evidence. Sandra had gone home at 11. The night was quiet in that way that hospital nights were quiet, not actually quiet, but full of sounds so familiar they became silence, ventilators, monitors, the soft shuffle of shift changes, the distant murmur of the emergency department 3 floors down. Margaret noticed the supply orders when she passed. She noticed the way Mercer looked at them, then looked up, then looked back down, as if he were trying to make 2 pieces fit that didn't want to fit together. She didn't slow her pace. She didn't acknowledge him or the paperwork or the narrowing of his eyes as she passed. She simply continued toward room for 47, where the monitors beat their patient rhythm and the 4 dripped its measured doses and Colonel Reeves lay exactly as he had laid the night before and the night before that, his chest rising and falling with the mechanical consistency of the ventilator. Margaret pulled the chair close to his bed, a ritual, like the touching of the patch, like the quiet speaking, and began her final rounds on him for the evening. She checked the dressing on his left side where the initial trauma had been worst, where the shrapnel had torn through muscle and bone in a way that no surgery had entirely fixed. She changed the dressing with movements that belonged to another life, another war, another person who had worn a rank and carried weapons and made split-second decisions that echoed forward 18 years into a life that was supposed to be forgotten. "Your second-in-command made it," she said quietly, continuing the conversation as if it had never paused. 3 tours with the 160th saw before he rotated to training. He's good. Really good. The kind of soldier that men will follow because they know he won't waste their lives. That's what you taught them. That matters, sir. That actually matters more than people understand. The intercom crackled somewhere in the distance, not for her, for someone else, and Margaret finished her work and stepped back. The bed looked exactly as it had looked before she began, which meant she had done her job correctly. The measurements were within range. The drip was steady. The man who had commanded her son in an operation that had gotten her killed on paper was alive in this room, in this bed, in a way that the databases said was impossible. She was halfway back to the nurse's station when her phone vibrated against her leg. Text message. From an unknown number. The text said only, "Check your email." Mercer. Margaret walked to the break room, poured a cup of coffee that had been burning on the warmer for probably 6 hours, and pulled out her phone. The email was already there, time-stamped 1:31 a.m. The subject line read, "Requesting background verification, Margaret and Walsh, RN." The body of the email listed a series of supply orders. Quantities that didn't match patient needs. Procedures billed to comatose patients. A pattern that would, if examined by someone who didn't understand what they were looking at, suggest either massive fraud or a nurse who didn't know what she was doing. Margaret read through the list methodically. Each item was accurate. Each item was also exactly what she had ordered and exactly what had been necessary to keep Colonel Reeves alive when the standard protocols would have let him die. The ventilator upgrade that had been billed as a replacement part for room for 43 but installed in for 47. The blood products coded as waste. The medication that came in at 2:36 a.m. on a Tuesday, when supply deliveries didn't usually arrive. She did not feel panic. Panic was a luxury for people with conventional lives. Instead, she felt the familiar sensation of a perimeter being drawn, a net being tightened, a problem that was going to require solutions from the part of her that she kept locked very carefully away from St. Michael's and Savannah and the carefully constructed life of the invisible night shift nurse. She deleted the email, set the phone on the counter, and sat with her hands wrapped around the cooling coffee, waiting for whatever came next, moving like someone who had already survived worse and therefore could afford to be patient. The morning rounds cart rattled through the ICU corridors at 6:44 a.m., trailed by 12 residents in pressed white coats and for attending physicians whose names meant something to people who kept track of such things. Dr. Mercer moved through the unit like a man accustomed to gravity bending around him, his voice carrying the particular cadence of someone who had never been interrupted and never expected to be. Margaret watched from the medication station, her hand steady on the syringe pump she was programming, her peripheral vision tracking the entourage as it approached room 447. She had learned long ago that invisibility was a privilege reserved for those patient enough to claim it. "Nurse Walsh," Mercer called out, his tone carrying the brightness of surgical theaters and country clubs. "Excellent timing. I want to use your chart as today's teaching moment." The residents turned. Margaret did not. She continued calibrating the infusion rate on Colonel Reeves for line, her movements precise and unhurried. This was mistake number one, at least in Mercer's calculation. Silence in the presence of authority was a form of insolence he had not been trained to recognize. "Come here," he said. Not a request. The surgical mentality, command structure as medical necessity. Margaret set down the pump and walked to where the group had assembled, the fluorescent lights casting everything in that particular hospital white that made healthy people look like they belonged in the beds. Mercer held up her documentation, 2 pages printed and bound, from the past 72 hours of Margaret's work with Colonel Reeves. His thumb pressed the corner as if the paper itself carried contamination. "What you're looking at," Mercer announced to the residents, his voice dropping into the register reserved for imparting wisdom to the young and moldable, "is what happens when we cling to outdated nursing practices. Nurse Walsh here refuses to pre-chart medications." Refuses. He let the word hang in the recycled air like a diagnosis. She insists on administering medications only after physical assessment of the patient. Apparently, she doesn't trust our hospital protocols. Our systems. He smiled at the residents. Apparently, one nurse's intuition trumps 3 decades of institutional procedure. A laugh moved through the group, that particular nervous laughter that residents deploy when they are uncertain whether they are supposed to find something funny but are quite certain they should laugh anyway. Margaret watched Mercer's face and saw what she had seen in faces before, a man who had mistaken the absence of pushback for the presence of consensus. "Grandma Walsh," Mercer continued, addressing her now with the diminishing tone of someone speaking to a person who had stopped listening. "Why do you think you know better than the protocols that our pharmacists and administrators spent months developing?" The residents waited. The attending physicians checked their watches. Mercer's expression held the satisfied curve of a man who had already won an argument that the other person had not realized they were having. Margaret said nothing. Her hands hung at her sides. Her eyes fixed on Mercer's with the kind of cold, even focus that comes from understanding, at a cellular level, that emotion is a luxury and reaction time is a resource. She stood there, absorbing his words like rainfall onto concrete, present, but leaving no mark. This silence was not weakness. It was the silence of someone taking inventory, of someone measuring, of someone who had learned in other contexts, in other deserts, under other names, that the most dangerous moment in any room is the moment just after someone realizes they have miscalculated. But Mercer did not possess the experience to read silence. He only possessed the ability to fill it. Perhaps retirement-age nurses struggle with the cognitive demands of 12-hour shifts, he said, turning back to his residents as if she had already left. "It's worth considering. The research suggests that sustained attention span. You talk like a man who's never had to account for anything that mattered." Margaret's voice came out like metal settling. "Quiet. Final." The words arrived in the space between his sentences and stayed there, refusing to move. She did not raise her voice. She did not gesture. She simply waited until his jaw stopped moving, until his eyes found hers, until every resident in the room understood that something had shifted in the atmospheric pressure. Then she turned with the kind of precision that comes from muscle memory, spine aligned, shoulders square, a movement that belonged to a different uniform, a different life, and walked back to the medication station. Her footsteps on the tile floor made sounds like a metronome counting out the distance between them. The rest of the rounds proceeded in a kind of stunned momentum, Mercer's voice continuing but its edges somehow dulled. Margaret worked. She did not glance up. She did not acknowledge the residents who lingered a moment too long when passing her station, their eyes bright with the recognition that they had witnessed something that did not fit into the institutional hierarchy they had been taught to navigate. 20 minutes later, Margaret stood in the break room with a coffee cup warming her hands. The room smelled like the particular staleness that accumulates when humans spend too much time in places that have no windows, old coffee grounds, the bittersweet yeast smell of heated creamer, the faint chemical bite of hand sanitizer. 6 colleagues occupied the break room in the way that people occupy rooms specifically to avoid being alone, 3 hunched over a vending machine with the intensity of people solving advanced mathematics, 2 reading the same coffee-stained printout from HR, and 1 pretending to search for something in the refrigerator. Mercer entered without knocking. He never knocked. He conducted a brief scan of the room as if assessing a floor plan, then positioned himself between Margaret and the exit. His voice adopted a conversational tone, the kind reserved for observations meant to carry. "I'm wondering," Mercer said, "whether nurses from a different generation, no offense intended, Margaret, whether you have the neurological stamina for 12-hour critical care shifts." He paused, as if the thought had only just occurred to him. The research is quite clear on age-related cognitive decline. Executive function particularly. The ability to make rapid decisions under pressure. Margaret poured her coffee with hands that did not shake. The stream of dark liquid fell in a straight line from pot to cup, physics, gravity, the observable laws of motion. She did not respond. The vending machine group remained fixated on their snack selection with the focus of people who had become suddenly very interested in whether they preferred barbecue or salt and vinegar flavored chips. "I only mention it," Mercer continued, his voice taking on the false brightness of concern, "because we have an obligation to our patients. If you're finding the schedule challenging, there are part-time positions available. Fewer hours. Less responsibility. Still valuable work, of course." Margaret raised the cup to her lips. The coffee was exactly the right temperature, neither too hot nor cooled by waiting. She took a sip, set the cup down on the counter beside the sink, and walked past him to the door. He did not step aside immediately, and she slowed her pace precisely enough that he had time to understand, before she reached him, that she would walk through him if the physics and his own sense of institutional dignity did not conspire to move him. He stepped aside. The ICU entrance stretched before her, a corridor lit by those same fluorescent panels that converted human beings into creatures who looked perpetually exhausted. The night shift would end in 4 hours. In 4 hours, Margaret would collect her badge from the security desk, would walk to her car, would drive to the house where her son was probably still asleep because he was 16 and the world had not yet taught him why sleep was a luxury. She would make eggs. She would not mention what had happened during rounds. "Margaret." Mercer's voice came from behind her, from the break room threshold. She did not turn. His footsteps accelerated. A word. She stopped. The corridor around her had emptied, the skeleton crew of night shift nurses and orderlies scattered across the unit's 12 rooms, each one absorbed in the consuming demands of the dying and the vulnerable. No witnesses. Mercer positioned himself with the kind of spatial authority that people employed when they believed their words would carry weight. "I'm going to be direct with you," he said. "Because I respect you, even if I don't agree with your methodology. The supply order discrepancies I've been tracking, the phantom procedures, the billing irregularities, all of it traces back to room for 47. All of it." He stepped closer. "One more word of insubordination, one more patient advocacy that supersedes established protocol, and I will have security escort you out. Immediately. Pending investigation. I think you understand what that means for someone your age, trying to find employment elsewhere." The threat hung in the air like an .4 drip, steady and precisely calibrated to cause maximum harm over time. Margaret turned to face him. Her eyes held his with the kind of steady focus that comes from a person who has already calculated every possible outcome and found them all acceptable. A stare cold enough to frost glass. A stare that had looked at things Mercer could not imagine. A stare that held no fear, no anger, no hope, just measurement, assessment, a final accounting of a man's true dimensions. She said nothing. She simply held his gaze for 3 seconds, let him understand that she had heard him, that she had evaluated him, that he had been found wanting, and then she walked away. Her footsteps on the tile floor echoed her returning composure. Behind her, Mercer stood motionless, his phone already in his hand, his fingers already reaching toward numbers he had already memorized, calls he would make, allies he would activate, the intricate architecture of institutional power he believed would protect him from anything a single nurse could do. What he did not understand, what he could not yet see, was that in approximately 4 hours, the night shift would enter its deepest phase. In room 447, Colonel Reeves' improvised chest tube would begin to slip. The monitors would begin their terrible chorus. The code would come, and when it came, everything Mercer believed he understood about power would shatter against the reality of who Margaret Walsh actually was. But that moment had not yet arrived. The clock in the ICU showed 2:02 a.m. remained for hours away. For now, Margaret returned to the medication station and her work. She was invisible again, which was precisely what she needed to be. The alarm screamed at 2:16 a.m. Margaret was restocking the medication cart when the monitor's wail split through the corridor, that specific tone that meant cardiac, that meant collapse, that meant room for 47. She moved without thinking. Her legs carried her down the hallway at a pace that looked casual but covered ground like a woman who'd sprinted through sandstorm darkness 1,000 times before. Colonel Reeves' chest tube had dislodged. She saw it the moment she entered, the tube hanging free, blood pooling in the pleural cavity, the monitor screaming its rhythm down from 118 to 105 to 94. His lung was filling. His oxygen saturation was dropping like a stone down a well, 92, 87, 83. The night shift residents had gathered at the doorway, frozen, all of them waiting for someone else to move first. "Call Dr. Mercer," one of them said. A young woman, probably PGY, too, voice steady but her hands weren't moving. Margaret didn't respond. She was already pulling gloves from the box beside the bed, snapping them with the sound of gunshots in the silence. One motion. Then she moved to the crash cart and slid open the top drawer where the scalpels lay in their sterile field, lined up like instruments in an operating room that didn't exist anymore, in a hospital that existed only in her muscle memory. The on-call surgeon was at County General, 22 minutes away. Maybe 18 if he ran the lights. The monitor showed 76 now. Oxygen sat at 71. Margaret's hands were already moving, running back to the crash cart, pulling the 14-gauge angiocath, the sterile drapes, the self-retaining retractor that would keep the ribs spread open while she worked. Everything she needed for an emergency thoracotomy was here. Everything except time. She had maybe 3 minutes. For if she was lucky. "I need the defibrillator pads off his chest," she said. Her voice had changed. It wasn't the careful deferential tone she used with Mercer. It wasn't the soft apologetic voice she used in the break room. This was command voice. This was the voice that had ordered Marines into Tikrit's worst neighborhoods and gotten them back alive. "Someone call the OR and tell them we're incoming. Page anesthesia. Now." The PGY-2 resident moved. So did a nurse, one of the older ones who recognized authority when she heard it. Margaret had already torn away the surgical drape covering Reeves' chest, exposing the comatose captain's ribs beneath the harsh fluorescent wash. The blood was still warm when her fingers found the space between the 5th and 6th ribs, the intercostal space where she'd done this before in a forward operating base outside Tikrit with a combat knife and morphine that was running out. She'd sewn him up with suture and prayer and the kind of focus that made everything else disappear. The scalpel was cold in her hand. Not unfamiliar. Muscle memory took over, the kind that lives in your hands, not your brain. The blade went in clean, for inches of incision through skin and fascia with the precision of someone who'd done it in sandstorm darkness, who'd done it while rounds were coming in, who'd done it when the alternative was watching another operator die. The hiss of air escaping. Blood on latex gloves. Her hand steady as a surgical laser while the room around her fell away. She had the retractor in place before anyone else finished moving. The rib spread. The cavity opened. She reached in, the cavity was full of blood, the lung compressed, the chest tube hanging useless, and her fingers found the source. The tube had slipped, torn through the parietal pleura, created a pocket of hemorrhage the size of a grapefruit. She repositioned the tube with the kind of certainty that comes from knowing this exact procedure in the dark, from knowing it when shells were landing and the forward base was shaking. Pressure on the bleeding points, she said. Gauze. Now. The PGY-2 resident was handing her supplies before the words finished. The other nurse was running toward the OR, running toward anesthesia, spreading the word that a patient was minutes from coding and moving toward the surgical floor. The monitor was climbing, 89, 93, 97. O2 sat at 78 and rising. Margaret worked with the kind of fluid precision that made watching her feel like watching something dangerous and beautiful at the same time. Her movements had no hesitation. No second guesses. The hands of someone who'd held lives together in worse places than this, under worse circumstances, with fewer resources and more people trying to kill her while she worked. The bleeding slowed. Stopped. She looked at the retractor, at the open chest, at the colonel's heart beating steadily beneath her fingers. Sinus rhythm. She didn't have to check the monitor, she could feel it. That's when Dr. Mercer appeared in the doorway. He stopped. His mouth opened. Closed. He was looking at her hands, wrist deep in an open chest cavity, performing an emergency thoracotomy with the kind of competence that required training he couldn't quite place, in a hospital where no nurse was supposed to know how to do this. His face went through a series of expressions the way a man's face goes through expressions when he realizes he's been looking at something he doesn't understand. "What are you?" he started. O2 saturation stabilized, Margaret said. Her voice was still command voice, still the tone that didn't ask questions. "We need an open bed in the OR. 5 minutes. The bleeding's controlled but the cavity needs proper assessment." She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the retractor, at the surgical field, at the way Reeves' chest rose and fell with breath, with life, with the oxygen that was pushing through his lungs now instead of pooling in blood. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm, 94, 97, 100. Sinus. Stable. Mercer's face had gone the color of old paper. His hands were opening and closing at his sides. He was looking at the thoracotomy, at an incision that would require a surgical text to understand, equipment he'd need to look up, a procedure that existed outside the scope of practice for anyone in scrubs who wasn't a trauma surgeon. The scalpel was still on the Mayo stand where she'd set it. The bloody gauze was in the trash. The drapes were soaked red. "Get her hand off the patient," Mercer said. His voice had changed too, but not the way Margaret's had. It had gotten small. "That's a violation of protocol. That's, someone call administration. That's practicing medicine without a license." Margaret looked at him then. Just for a second. Just long enough for him to see that she was still inside the chest cavity, still working, still doing the one thing in this hospital that mattered more than his protocols or his titles or his careful network of favors that he'd been building for 3 years. "We need to move," she said to the residents. To the nurses. To everyone except Mercer. Operating room. Now. This patient is minutes away from cardiopulmonary arrest without proper intervention. The stretcher was already being wheeled in. The anesthesia cart was in the hallway. The OR team was scrubbing. Margaret stepped back from the retractor, carefully, hand steady, movements precise, and let the surgical team take over. The thoracotomy incision would be cleaned up in the OR. The chest would be properly closed. The patient would live. Colonel Reeves was going to live. That was all that mattered. But as she turned to step away from the bed, she caught Mercer's expression again. It wasn't surprise anymore. It was calculation. It was the look of a man who'd just discovered a problem that needed to be solved faster than he'd planned, more aggressively than he'd anticipated, in a way that would require calling in more favors than he'd budgeted for. She watched him pull his phone from his pocket as the surgical team moved past him with the stretcher. She watched him step into the hallway and dial someone. She watched his mouth move, couldn't hear the words over the monitors and the movement, but she knew what he was saying. She could read it in the set of his shoulders, in the angle of his head, in the way his free hand was making fists and opening, fists and opening. The institutional machinery was already moving against her. She could feel it the way she'd felt incoming rounds before they landed, the way she'd felt the presence of threats before they announced themselves. Mercer didn't have the power to destroy her personally, but he had the phone, and the phone had connections, and the connections had resources. By morning, she knew, there would be inquiries. By noon, there would be investigators. By this evening, she would be standing in a conference room somewhere explaining how a night shift nurse knew how to perform a thoracotomy, and there would be no good answer because the truth wasn't available. The truth was classified. The truth was buried in databases she wasn't supposed to access anymore, in a past that was supposed to stay buried, in a rank and a service record that had been erased for purposes of national security. But that wasn't the problem now. The problem now was that she'd saved Colonel Reeves' life, and in doing so, she'd revealed something she'd spent 3 years carefully concealing. The stretcher disappeared into the elevator. The doors closed. The alarm stopped screaming. The monitor flatlined for 1 terrible second before they got him up to the OR, just a second of silence where everything in Margaret's chest stopped, where her hands almost moved toward the defibrillator, where 3 years of careful invisibility shattered like glass. Then the monitor came back. Sinus rhythm again. Steady. The surgical team had him. He was going to the place where people who knew how to handle this kind of damage could work. Margaret stripped off her gloves. The latex snapped like gunfire as she peeled them away. There was blood under her fingernails, not hers. Never hers. The blood of someone she'd kept alive every night shift for 3 years, someone she'd whispered apologies to while thinking about her son, someone she'd never been able to explain to. She walked back toward the medication station. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the specific tremor that comes after combat, that comes after your body has been running on adrenaline and muscle memory and pure necessity for longer than your conscious mind can track. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the body's way of releasing what the mind had held locked tight. Dr. Mercer was still in the hallway, phone pressed to his ear, eyes tracking her as she moved. She didn't look at him. She didn't acknowledge that he was there. She moved past him the way she'd moved past 1,000 obstacles, the way she'd moved through Tikrit's worst neighborhoods, the way she'd moved through the last 3 years of her life. Invisible. Professional. Done. But in her pocket, her phone had already begun to buzz. Once. Twice. 3 times. Messages arriving. The institutional machinery was moving. She had maybe 12 hours before it came for her. By morning, the machinery had started. Dr. Mercer made 3 phone calls before 7 a.m., each one carefully calibrated. The first went to hospital administration, concern about a nurse performing unauthorized surgical procedures, the kind of liability that kept board members awake. The second went to the State Nursing Board investigator's office. The third went to his mentor at Johns Hopkins, who still owed him favors from fellowship days. He didn't raise his voice. He never did. He simply stated facts, let implications hang like fog. By 10 a.m., a woman in a grey blazer was walking through the corridors of St. Michael's with a badge clipped to her lapel. State Nursing Board. She had Margaret's file open, thin, Margaret noticed, just her credentials and the vague notation of employment history before 2008. Everything before that was redacted. Everything after was documented with the precision of someone who knew how to bury truth under routine. The investigator's questions were polite. Clinical. Can you walk me through your educational background? Where did you work before St. Michael's? Why are there gaps in your employment history from 2003 to 2008? Margaret's answers were short. Practiced. Military service. Medical corps. The investigator's pen paused for exactly 1 second, the kind of pause that meant she'd heard that term before and knew it sometimes meant things that couldn't be verified. Do you have documentation? Margaret shook her head. Some records didn't exist. That was the point. By noon, an email landed in administration's inbox from Dr. Mercer to the chief medical officer. The language was surgical. I have concerns regarding a staff member's ability to fulfill her duties. Specifically, there are unverifiable gaps in her employment history from 2003 to 2008, and I witnessed what appeared to be unauthorized medical procedures being performed by this individual. As Director of Surgery, I felt obligated to bring this matter to your attention for credentialing review. It was a masterpiece of competence. Not an accusation. An observation. The kind that made board members convene emergency meetings and HR directors pull files. Margaret's name was called over the intercom at 1:45 p.m. Margaret Walsh. Please report to administration. She knew what it meant. She'd known since the moment Mercer walked into the ICU and saw her hand steady on a surgical field. The elevator rose slowly. She counted the floors, an old habit. 4th floor. 4th floor was where they fired people. The HR director was a woman named Patricia Chen, maybe 55, who'd been doing this job for 12 years and had learned to separate the human from the process. She didn't make eye contact. We've received notification from both the State Nursing Board and the Chief Medical Officer regarding concerns about your credentials and employment history. Specifically, there are gaps we cannot verify, and there's an allegation of you performing medical procedures outside your scope of practice. Margaret didn't speak. Pending investigation into these matters, we're placing you on administrative leave, effective immediately. You'll need to turn in your badge. Your locker will be secured. You can have personal items removed by end of business today, provided they don't constitute hospital property. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a conversation. It was the machinery, grinding forward. Margaret set her badge on the desk, the small blue rectangle that had been her identity for 3 years. Patricia slid a plastic bag across the desk. Not a box. Not even a paper bag with dignity. A clear plastic grocery bag. Security can help you with your locker. Margaret shook her head. She didn't need help. She knew how to extract with minimal footprint. She left through the side entrance, the one by the loading dock where deliveries came and went. Her scrubs were still damp from the shift before, sweat, antiseptic, something metallic that wouldn't wash out. She drove home in silence, didn't turn on the radio, didn't call anyone. The steering wheel was smooth under her hands. Her breathing was even. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. She sat in the driveway for 20 minutes. The house looked smaller than she remembered. The mailbox was full. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked. She changed out of her scrubs, pulled off the damp fabric, hung it in the bathroom sink, stood under the shower spray until the water ran clear. But she couldn't move past that point. She put on jeans and a shirt and sat at the kitchen table. That's where David found her. He came through the door at 3:16 p.m., backpack slung over one shoulder, humming something from calculus class. The sound of homework and normalcy. Then he stopped. His mother was at the table, still somehow in her scrubs in her mind, eyes fixed on the grain of the wood. Her hands were folded. She wasn't moving. Mom. His voice cracked on the single syllable. Why are you home? She didn't answer. Couldn't. Her throat had closed somewhere between the hospital and here, and she couldn't seem to open it again. Did someone die? He dropped his backpack. That was his first thought, that death was the only reason his mother would be home at 3:44 p.m., sitting motionless at the kitchen table. She shook her head. Her eyes filled, and the first tear fell before she could stop it. 16 years of control, and it broke like glass. More followed. Her hands went up to cover her face, and she cried silently into her palms the way she'd been trained never to do, shoulders shaking, breath coming in controlled bursts that looked like sobs but moved like military breathing exercises even now. David sat down beside her, terrified. "Mom, what happened?" "I'm sorry, baby. I'm so sorry." She couldn't say it any other way. The apology wasn't for him. It was for herself, for the boy who'd never asked for this, for the family that had fractured itself across 3 decades of secrets. "I'm sorry." He didn't understand. He sat there, 16 years old and watching his mother fall apart, which meant the world was ending and he didn't know how to stop it. He put his hand on her shoulder. "You're scaring me." She couldn't tell him. Not yet. Not while her hands were shaking and her voice was gone. She just sat there, crying silently into her hands for the first time he'd ever seen, while David sat beside her and understood that something had broken open and he didn't have the tools to put it back together. Later that night, after Margaret had retreated to her room and closed the door, David stood in the hallway outside the bedroom he shared with his childhood and didn't know what to do with his body. He opened her closet. It smelled like her, antiseptic and something underneath, something burnt. He found the field jacket hanging in the back, beneath winter sweaters no one wore in Savannah. It was old. Older than he was. The fabric was heavy, worn soft by hands and time. He found the patch sewn inside the lining. Stitched carefully, deliberately, by someone who had intended to hide it and keep it simultaneously. The lettering was faded but readable: 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, a dark horse. A unit designation. A military insignia stitched into the interior of a secret. His hands shook as he pulled the box from beneath the sweaters. It was a shadow box, the kind that held decorations for display. But it had never been displayed. It had been buried. He opened it slowly, like something fragile might shatter. Silver Star. Purple Heart. Combat Action Ribbon. Another Purple Heart. A citation with his mother's name, Captain Margaret Elizabeth Walsh, printed on official military letterhead, the text largely redacted except for 3 words that weren't "Valor in combat." His mother was a military officer. His mother had been in combat. His mother had been someone entirely different from the woman who left for night shifts at the hospital. Someone the Pentagon had apparently erased from every database that mattered. David sat on the floor of his mother's closet, reading words that referenced classified operations and enemy fire and medical procedures under conditions he couldn't even imagine. His hands shook as he read. His voice, when it finally came, was barely a whisper: "Mom, what did you do?" 3 days later, David walked into the hospital board meeting unannounced. 3 days passed like a held breath. David Walsh hadn't slept more than 2 hours a night since he found the medals. The Silver Star sat on the kitchen counter like a question mark his mother wouldn't answer. The Purple Heart, 2 of them, caught the light from different angles depending on the time of day. He'd stared at them until his eyes burned, trying to match the woman in his kitchen to the woman who had earned them. Nothing fit. Everything fit. By the 3rd morning, something in his chest shifted from confusion into clarity. His mother hadn't hidden those medals because she was ashamed. She'd hidden them because someone had made her ashamed. And now she was sitting at home unemployed while the man who'd done it kept walking hospital corridors. David carried the shadow box into St. Michael's at 8:51 a.m. He didn't have an appointment. He didn't ask for permission. The hospital board was meeting on the 4th floor. He'd heard his mother mention it once, 3 years ago, when she was still sleeping at night. He walked past security with the confidence of someone who had nothing left to lose, which was exactly what he had. The conference room doors were glass. He could see them: administrators in navy suits, the hospital director, the patient safety officer, the chief of medical staff. They were discussing supply chain audits when the doors swung open. David stepped inside. Nobody moved. "I'm David Walsh," he said. His voice was clear as a surgical blade. "My mother is Margaret Walsh. You fired her 3 days ago." The silence had weight. It pressed against the walls like atmospheric pressure changing before a storm. He walked to the table, opened the shadow box, set it down with both hands like a man placing a detonator. The silver star caught the fluorescent light first, then the purple heart, then the second purple heart, then the combat action ribbon. Its fabric faded from desert sun and sand that had no right to be carried across an ocean and into a hospital in Georgia. She was ordered never to display these, David said. His fingers didn't shake. Operation Enduring Sentinel. That's what she told me. She said the Pentagon had a classification order on her service record. She said she wasn't allowed to talk about it. She said that was the deal. He looked at each face around the table. My mother doesn't break rules. So she hid these. And then she went to work at your hospital and saved people you didn't think were worth saving. And your Dr. Mercer destroyed her for it. The hospital director's face had gone the color of hospital walls. Mom, they need to see these. That's what his mother had whispered, maybe 100 times, when she thought he was asleep. Not a demand. Not anger. Just the weight of something unsaid, finally finding a voice. Down the corridor, in room for 47, Colonel James Reeves opened his eyes for the first time in 8 months. The light hit him like revelation. White ceiling. Antiseptic smell, copper-edged, sharp. The breathing tube was gone. He could feel the ventilator's rhythm on his chest, that hiss of air that had become the metronome of survival. His throat felt like someone had rebuilt it from gravel and silence. His vision came into focus in layers, the heart monitor, its rhythm climbing from the underwater place he'd been living in. 72, 76. 81, the curve of the ICU bed. The four-pole with its careful mathematics of fluids and medication. And then, a word. One word. The syllables locked in his throat, requiring years of rusted muscle to unlock. Valkyrie. The Marine Corps liaison standing at the window went absolutely white. His hand moved to his phone before his brain finished processing what he'd heard. Valkyrie wasn't a call sign. It was a code name for a medical operation so classified that the Pentagon's official denial of its existence existed in a separate classified file. Valkyrie meant there was a woman in this hospital who had received medals the government couldn't acknowledge, training they couldn't discuss, orders that transcended normal chains of command. It meant something the liaison had only heard about in the kind of briefings where men wore wire-free suits and cell phones waited outside. Valkyrie meant the comatose patient in front of him was important enough that his awakening required an immediate call to people 3 layers above his own command authority. The phone was already in his hand. 2 floors up, in the hospital's main conference room, a young Marine in dress blue stood at rigid attention. His voice was steady as a laser until he read the 3rd line of the citation. His eyes found the medals on the table and something in him fractured. He was reading honors to the daughter of a warrior who had done something heroic in a place that didn't officially exist, for a government that couldn't officially acknowledge her. The words came harder after that, for extraordinary valor under fire, Captain Margaret Walsh, Special Forces Medical Corps, risked her own life to maintain surgical field stability during Operation Enduring Sentinel. 16 service members survived hostile fire in Tikrit due to Captain Walsh's decisive intervention. Her actions exemplify the highest traditions of military service and medical excellence in conditions where both were impossible. The door burst open. Dr. Mercer stood in the threshold like something that had been given license to perform one final act of destruction. "This circus ends now," he said. His voice carried the edge of a man who could feel ground collapsing beneath his feet. "This hospital is not a platform for narratives that have no bearing on current employment disputes. I move to adjourn this meeting and refer this matter back to the State Nursing Board investigation, which is." A 2-star general entered the conference room. Not walked in. Entered. The air pressure changed. He was wearing full dress uniform. His ribbons alone told the story of the kind of man who didn't arrive at hospital board meetings without a reason that transcended administrative procedure. He looked at Mercer. Then at the medals. Then at the faces around the table. Then at Dr. Mercer again. He rendered a full salute to the decorations on the table. The kind of salute that was an acknowledgement of sacrifice that transcended normal rank structure. "Captain Walsh saved 16 lives the night we don't talk about," the general said. His voice was the sound of institutional weight, of authority that couldn't be challenged or negotiated. "She's a Medal of Honor candidate, not a subject for investigation." Everything stopped. The room held its breath like a patient waiting for test results that would redefine existence. A Pentagon representative arrived within the hour, a woman in a charcoal suit who carried a leather portfolio with the kind of heft that suggested classified documentation. She sat at the table. She looked at the shadow box. She looked at the faces of the assembled hospital leadership. She looked at Dr. Mercer. Valkyrie was a code name, she said quietly, for a classified medical operation behind enemy lines in Tikrit during Operation Enduring Sentinel. Captain Walsh was the primary medical officer. She maintained surgical conditions using field instruments and improvised technique under sustained hostile fire. The operation resulted in 16 service members returning to theater. That operation was sealed at the highest classification level. Captain Walsh maintained her security clearance through her silence. By terminating her employment, this hospital created a legal problem that I'm required to document. She closed the portfolio. The Pentagon requests that St. Michael's preserve all documentation related to Captain Walsh's employment record. This hospital has been selected for a compliance review. The words compliance review hung in the air like a sentence that had already been carried out. That evening, a phone camera captured video of the general rendering a salute to Margaret Walsh's medals. Someone uploaded it to Twitter at 9:43 p.m. By midnight, it had 847,000 views. By 2 a.m., 4 million. #Valkyrianers trended worldwide. News vans arrived at St. Michael's by dawn. Reporters with that particular intensity that comes from knowing they'd stumbled into something bigger than hospital administration stood in the parking lot, broadcasting live as cars pulled in and staff members realized that the invisible nurse from the night shift had just become the most visible person in the building. Dr. Mercer's phone rang at 3:17 a.m. Board members whose calls he'd been making for 3 days suddenly had time to talk to him. None of it was good. The supply order investigation had expanded. The kickback arrangements with the medical device company. The phantom procedures billed to comatose patients. The federal investigators were coming. His attorney was advising immediate resignation. His mentor, Dr. Richard Castellano from Johns Hopkins, the man who'd written his recommendation letters, who'd toasted his career at his graduation, who'd taught him that protocol existed for a reason, saw the viral video of Mercer bursting into the board meeting, calling Margaret Walsh's decorated service a circus. Castellano sent a public letter within 4 hours. The internet read it like scripture. I can no longer associate my name with a physician who displays such profound lack of judgment and character. Dr. Mercer does not represent the values I attempted to instill. The letter went viral within 6 minutes. The hospital board convened an emergency meeting without him. The state investigator quietly closed the file after a phone call from someone whose title Margaret never learned. The compliance review became a full audit. Every supply order. Every procedure. Every billable hour. The structure that had held Mercer up, the network of administrators who owed him favors, the board members who benefited from his arrangements, the system that had protected him for 15 years, collapsed like a house made from paper and debt. The voices that had laughed in the break room while he mocked her age suddenly had no memory of being present. The colleagues who'd studied the vending machine while he humiliated her were now making statements to investigators about concerns they'd held but been afraid to voice. By week's end, Dr. Mercer had surrendered his hospital privileges. By the following week, his medical license review was pending. The only job offer he received came from Savannah Community College, teaching CPR fundamentals to high school students for minimum wage. He sat in a fluorescent-lit classroom at 3 p.m. on a Thursday, demonstrating chest compressions on a dummy's plastic chest while 15 teenagers checked their phones. The thud of his hands on the plastic was the sound of a man mechanically going through motions that had lost all meaning. In the back row, a girl was streaming him on Instagram. By evening, 17,000 people had watched Dr. Mercer fail at resuscitating a doll. He saw Margaret's face on the news that same night. She was being honored. And he understood, in the way men understand moments that define the end of their lives, that he had spent his career dismissing someone who carried the weight of sacrifice he'd never earned the right to understand. 6 months later, Margaret Walsh returned to St. Michael's as Director of Critical Care. She walked through the same fluorescent corridors where she'd been humiliated, but now staff members stood taller when she approached. They said her name like it meant something. Respect changed the way people moved around her. Her office overlooked the ICU. On the wall hung the governor's certificate for civilian valor in medical excellence. In her desk drawer, beneath the official letters and commendations, she kept the faded Special Forces unit patch her son had found sewn inside her jacket lining, the only piece of Tikrit she'd allowed herself to keep. She would touch it sometimes when she thought nobody was looking. It felt like permission to have survived. Colonel Reeves had been transferred to Walter Reed for advanced rehabilitation. His recovery was slow, methodical, the kind of healing that required patience and the kind of physical therapy that made a person question whether recovery was even possible. But he sent Margaret a letter. It sat framed on her desk. "Valkyrie, you saved me twice. Once in Tikrit. Once in Savannah. Your son's commanding officer is proud. Welcome home." David visited her at work on a Saturday morning. He was wearing a U.S. Marine Corps dress uniform now. He'd signed up 2 weeks after she got fired. He stood in her office doorway looking like an adult, like someone who'd understood something about honor and service that most people never grasped. "Why did you hide it?" he asked. "All of it. The medals. The rank. Everything." Margaret's fingers traced the unit patch in her drawer. The embroidery had faded from desert sun and time and deliberate silence. She could see the mission insignia even though she wasn't supposed to talk about what it meant. "Because some things you do aren't for recognition," she said. "They're because someone has to. And the moment you start performing the doing, you've already lost what made it matter." David understood. Or he would, eventually. The hospital hosted the ceremony on a Friday evening in the main auditorium. News cameras captured every moment. The governor presented Margaret with the state's highest civilian honor for medical valor. Former colleagues who had studied the vending machine while Mercer humiliated her now stood and applauded. The board chair made a public statement apologizing for the investigation, acknowledging concerns we failed to address with the appropriate urgency. The words had the flavor of institutional surrender, of systems admitting they'd operated wrong. Margaret's acceptance speech was brief. She stood at the podium with the poise of someone who'd held instrument steady in darkness. The cameras wanted her to cry or to rage or to demand retribution. She did none of these things. "True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching," she said. Her eyes found the camera directly. "It's the choice to act with integrity when nobody will ever know. It's tending to the invisible. It's holding steady when everything is breaking. That work is its own reward. The recognition is secondary. The witness is internal." She stepped away from the podium. The applause started slowly, then built like something inevitable. Mercer watched the ceremony from his car in the community college parking lot. His phone showed the live stream. He watched Margaret accept her honors. He watched her speak about integrity with the kind of authority that suggested she'd lived it rather than just studied it. He watched the governor present the medal. And when the applause started, he closed the video. He sat in his car in the empty parking lot and understood that some people spend careers building institutions while other people, the quiet ones, the ones you dismiss, are actually holding them up. By the time he understood, it was too late to matter. Margaret returned to her office and closed the door. She touched the unit patch one more time. Outside her window, the ICU hummed with the sound of lives being saved by people who would never be publicly recognized for it. A young nurse was struggling with a central line placement. Margaret stood, walked to the ICU, and stood beside the bed. She didn't speak. She just moved her hands, showing the angle, the pressure, the precision. The young nurse watched. And learned. And understood. That was the work. That was always the work. The rest was just noise. Hit that like button if you appreciate the nurses and healthcare workers in your life. Drop a comment if you've ever worked in medicine or know someone who has. Subscribe and let's see what happens next.